make a start, let me do the introductions, and we'll see some faces a little bit more clearly. So I'm Jen Charteris, the Exec Director of Crosslands. I'm kind of in the facilitator's chair today because the book was my suggestion as something we might cover. So I'll be leading us through the conversation, but also familiar to many of you will be Dan Strange, who's the director of Crosslands Forum, and also our colleague Jonathan Norgate, who is part of the Crosslands faculty leading on cross-cultural mission and ministry tracks and some of our doctrine teaching and so on. So we're the panel. Let's get going. So we're talking about transforming friendship. I've got my copy here. Let me explain why we have ended up landing on this and thinking it was worth doing a book review. I was gifted a copy of this a few months ago, and it sort of sat in my pile of books to get round to reading. And then Dan and I had a conversation with John Wyatt at some point, where it wasn't about the book, it was about our plans for him to come and be a speaker at our winter conference, which is just to flag that for you. But that conversation gave me a bit of a light bulb moment when I grasped really what John's purpose was in writing the book. And so it went to the top of the pile, and I found it really interesting and helpful. It's fueled a number of conversations on walks with my husband. It's enriched my thinking about sort of certain aspects of how we go about developing leaders. It's challenged me personally, and it's a really easy and enjoyable read. I should add that I've got some questions about some aspects of the book, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in a little while. One of the key things that sort of struck me as really interesting is that it's quite hard to categorize. It's, is it a memoir or a manifesto? And it seems to sort of cross those two sort of areas and categories. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more. In the book, John Wyatt uses the term in the title "transforming" as both a verb and an adjective. He's arguing that friendship needs to be transforming. Friendship needs to be transformed, and also that friendship can and should be quite transformative for the friends involved. And he goes quite a lot further than that. He's also making a case for the power of godly cross-generational friendships to transform communities and society. And it's quite a big claim. I think it's quite well supported in the examples that he cites, and also in his own personal experience. But before I go on, let me turn to you, Dan, and then Jonathan. Just what was your kind of initial reaction, response to the book, and how are you kind of summarizing your take on it?
I think it's a very timely book. I think what John wants to do is not just deal with where things can go wrong, which he does talk about in the book, but a kind of a real positive agenda, and maybe some, I don't know, risk taking would be not the right word, but a really intentional friendship. What intentional friendship looks like that isn't, and this is maybe one thing we'll touch on, isn't mentoring, isn't coaching, isn't consultancy, but is friendship. And that is a very defined term for John on a spectrum of other things as well, which I think is worth exploring as well. But I think you're right in terms of not, the book is a mixture of things, I suppose. And I suppose that memoir manifesto is a good way of putting it. But yeah, lots of really helpful things, some things to kind of question maybe and push back on a little bit. But that's I found it really thoughtful and engaging.
Right. How about you, Jonathan?
Yeah, same too. I actually really enjoyed reading it. I think he does something which is quite difficult to do, which is to kind of interweave kind of reflections on culture, philosophy, worldview, kind of, and as well as sort of introduce a kind of some helpful reflections on his reading of scripture, and interweave that with a very personal kind of testimony about his own experience, obviously primarily located in his experience of friendship with John Stott. And I think that, you know, that it's a very stimulating read, whether or not you are persuaded by every aspect of the argument. And you know, we'll come back to those, you know, to some of the questions that we might have. And actually, at points, I found it a really moving book to read. You know, and that again, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not manipulative in any way, but you know, the points in the story, points in the book, which you know, yeah, were very, very moving, and you know, so I think it's a valuable book book to read on many levels. Yeah.
Yeah, the memoir element, for those who are not familiar, as Jonathan referred to, is sort of reflections on John's own friendship with John Stott, and the impact that had on helping him to become something of a Christian thought leader in the whole area of medicine, medical ethics, and so on. And I think I would be concerned if it would be concerning if a whole sort of model of how friendship might work was built on the sort of memoir element, you know, that one example and experience. I mean, just for a whole bunch of reasons, we're all instinctively quite wary about that nowadays. But he builds it on so much more, doesn't he? He builds it on sort of biblical frameworks, quite ancient history as well as more recent history. And a bunch of other stories and testimonies and so on. And part of John's motivation for writing the book is that he perceives correctly, in my view, that we're actually in quite an unhealthy state regarding you know, how we view friendship, both in the world at large and also amongst ourselves as evangelicals. And one of the things I especially appreciated is the way that he's actually taken all of that head on. And then countered it with a much more sort of positive vision of relationships and friendships and so on. So that was our initial sort of response to the book. What we'll do is sort of walk through some of the big themes in the book. We're not going to do it quite in the order in which John covers it, because, for example, from a historical perspective, he sort of dots around amongst different sort of phases and angles of history. But we thought we'd give you a little bit of a summary of some of the perspectives he covers. So, Jonathan, do you want to just highlight how he roots things in Scripture?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So the book, the way he structured the book is really interesting, I think. And so he kind of interweaves, he comes back and forth to themes. It's not really a linear, I mean, it's a linear argument, but you know, maybe we'll come back to this, the way he's structured the book. But he introduces his biblical kind of theology of friendship in between reflections on history, kind of cultural history, philosophy, and then this personal testimony. But he gives his most sustained kind of analysis of the Bible, and its understanding, the biblical understanding of friendship in chapters 3 and 7. And he starts off by commenting, I guess, as a somebody coming to this area of scholarship new, how the theme of friendship appears to be lacking in commentary among scholars, which I think is quite an interesting point, given his critique of the practice of friendship within the church. Anyway, that's something maybe we'll discuss. But he looks at friendship in the Old Testament, noting how there are a number of different words for friend used, or at least in the English translation. But he focuses on the definitions and examples of what he calls the intense, intimate bond of love and loyalty between two people. So he sees that, for example, in Proverbs 18:24. And crucially, I think he identifies that as chosen friendships. So he distinguishes examples of friendship in the Bible, you know, of kinship friendships with those that are chosen. And those friendships he sees depicted, characterized by certain things, deep trust, codependence, and pain. So he identifies, for example, in the Psalms, how friendship is described in many places, in terms of a painful experience, of betrayal, but also experience where friendship is the scene of kind of honesty, where um, where friends experience the kind of painful moment of honing or being perfected, in the kind of in honest and open friendship. Um, he looks and really zooms in on the Old Testament vision of friendship being rooted in the concept of covenant. Um, and so he looks at God's covenantal love, steadfastness, the faithfulness of God, really as the way to understand and interpret the biblical understanding of friendship. And then he zooms in and he looks at the examples of Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan, and I think gives some really interesting detail on both of those stories. So, for example, with Ruth and Naomi, he identifies the way in which there's a practical mutual caring. It's intergenerational, it's interracial. There are those dynamics in that relationship. And then with David and Jonathan, he picks out how, in terms of Jonathan's covenantal friendship, it leads him to encourage David to be what God intended him to be. He's quoting Dostoevsky at that point. Anyway, so using covenant as his kind of as his key, to help understand and grasp what friendship with God really means. It's a hermeneutical tool for him to understand God's relationship with Israel, including for him a way of understanding some of the more surprising features of God's interaction with his people. For example, in Exodus 32, where with God's apparent willingness to listen to, and Wyatt uses the term "be vulnerable with." We might want to come back to that. Be vulnerable with Moses. After this, he moves on to friendship in the New Testament. He sees Jesus as someone who subverts rabbinic practices and roles, and this culminates in his declaration to his disciples in John 15 that they're no longer servants but friends. So as a result of that, he sees that the essence of Christ-like friendship is not only love, joy, and intimacy, but loyalty and self-sacrifice. He carries on in that chapter, considering Paul's friendships in the churches, and then he moves on to in chapter 7 to do a kind of a more detailed analysis of Timothy, of Paul's relationship with Timothy. And interesting, he begins that with a comment about John Stott's commentary on 1 Timothy, looking at some of the features of that relationship, which he then kind of brings in to his outline of how friendship could, what deep friendship could look like. So that's basically how he attends to the Bible. Thanks.
Yeah, he ranges quite wide. Was there anything either sort of particularly sort of new and refreshing for you, just in the way he set that out, or just a sort of standout point from amongst all of that for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that the point that I mentioned, where he's sort of discussing David and Jonathan, I think we're quite familiar with kind of looking at Ruth, Naomi, David, and Jonathan as some examples of friendship. But I think he brought out details of the way in which those manifest express aspects of covenantal relationship, and therefore have manifest or express God's what posture of friendship towards us, and in that detail that I mentioned about how Jonathan was concerned for David to be what God intended him to be. So it's a very intimate, it's a very kind of particular kind of detail in the story of that friendship that struck me. Yeah.
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 Another big sort of theme that he builds through the book in different ways is really a sort of historical perspective. Let me just outline briefly what he's doing there. There are sort of broadly three elements, three or four maybe elements to that. He goes back to the sort of classics and has a look at how, well, first of all, sort of challenging us to realize how loosely we use the word friendship in the current day. You know, we can be a Facebook friend through to very close friends, and that the English language doesn't serve us all that well because of the kind of range of what that actually means. He dips into classical sort of history and literature, and just identifies that, you know, of the different kinds of love that philia is described as a sort of intimate, committed, non-sexual type of friendship, perhaps in many ways some of what he's kind of leaning towards just describing here. Although he acknowledges that that's, you know, very much a sort of male to male thing, and doesn't address both men and women and so on. And as you've described, Jonathan, it's is both similar and different to sort of biblical account of healthy friendship. A really big thread in the book, which he spends quite a lot of time covering, is a sort of changing understanding of the self in the sort of history of philosophy, and how that has fed through to how we perceive relationships and friendships today. And how, just sort of he starts with Descartes and working through the sort of John Stuart Mill autonomy and sovereignty of the self, and the personal freedoms that were being driven through romanticism. All of that starting to sort of dismantle a kind of settled sense of who you are as a self, and then sort of tracks through into the work of Freud and the influence of the sort of sexualization of relationships, and how that starts to change the kind of ease with which we might think of friendships as non-sexual, and then tracks further on through Nietzsche, Foucault, and so on. I won't go into detail there. I found this enormously interesting to see it all threaded together, and he does it in quite a sort of dense but accessible way, reminding us just of, you know, how all of these things fed through to the 1960s. The big medical development of oral contraception, and just how all of that comes together to a point where we sort of have a great deal of difficulty kind of separating out intimacy and from sexualization of relationships, and how much we've really lost on that. And he particularly lands on the sort of hermeneutic of suspicion, and how that's perhaps damaging our ability to form close friendships. A bit later on in the book, sort of comes back at history and from a different dimension, and picks up on evangelical leaders and the extraordinary sort of power that healthy friendships have had on mission, on the work of the gospel, in reaching not just England, but the wider world through mission, and the work of Simeon, Newton, and Wilberforce are the ones that he lands on, and that whole kind of Clapham group of friends, and the powerful impact that they had. And so in doing that, he is both addressing head on you know, why we've ended up with the issues of suspicion and in intimacy in relation to intimate friendships, but also holding up this much more positive vision. But all of that, Dan, threads around, sort of winds its way around his own sort of personal testimony, and the more specific sort of memoir part of the book. Do you want to pick us?
Yeah. So very quickly, 1974, 50 years ago. I know that because that's the year of my birth. Is he's a second year medical student, has gone to All Souls, and Stott invites him for coffee. That's the title of the chapter, and it's really just narrating that friendship that started there. Interestingly, I mean, again, we maybe want to pick up on this. I mean, John Wyatt says that John Stott never. This was a kind of private, hidden counterpoint of his ministry. So, I mean, in the 70s, Stott's at the height of his power and influence, and yet there's this other ministry that's going on, this ministry of friendship, which John Wyatt says he didn't talk about much. He just did it. And what does then he explores what gospel crafted friendship looks like. Stott himself was formed, obviously. And the key influence here is Eric Nash, known as Bash in terms of the Bash camps, and how John Wyatt's view is that Nash became a surrogate family for Stott, especially when there was difficulties with Stott's relationship with his father because of that he was a conscientious objector, and that Nash wrote to him persistently over many years. Interestingly, John Wyatt notes in a few cases that sometimes Nash's letters could be fairly disciplinarian, chastising, and that Stott's letters were not like that. And he makes the distinction that there was the persistence of communication, but maybe the style was slightly different. I think the other thing then, as it's tracing this friendship that John Wyatt had with John Stott, was that this is the time when Stott's really exploring, I suppose, the social conscience of evangelicalism. The Bible in one hand, the newspaper in the other, and that meant that Stott wanted with his friends to be talking about the matters of the day. So it's interesting. They start doing a book group. They start watching films. Very interesting line about, they even looked at things like Cosmopolitan. I mean, the thought of John Stott reading Cosmopolitan is hilarious. I think the other thing is that, I mean, John Wyatt really believes that Stott lived the way that he preached. He says oftentimes you can hear someone and they're great in public and they don't really deliver in private, but that Stott for Wyatt was more than expected. He was almost better in private than he was in person in a certain sense. And that all of these relationships or godliness is in authenticity, honesty, and humility. And there's some stuff on dialogue in that chapter as well, but it finishes with a section on sharing vulnerabilities. And I think I suppose one of the most moving bits that maybe Jonathan alluded to is at the beginning. That there's a Stott. There's a seniority with Stott in terms of his experience and his maturity with Wyatt, but at the end of his life, I think there are vulnerabilities that Stott shares with Wyatt, especially towards the end of his life when I think he is becoming more and more infirm, and Wyatt is kind of with him, looking after him, and it's obviously there's been times in both of their lives where they both relied on each other, looked to one another in different ways in different seasons. So that's something of the charting of the relationship that they had.
Yeah. And Dan, are you going to kind of lead us on to thinking a little bit about one of the things I appreciated about the book is that John Wyatt is willing to address kind of what goes wrong and holds out this kind of very, very positive vision for transforming friendship.
Yeah.
But take us through some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways, given the climate of a book like this, John Wyatt's got to come out swinging a little bit, because the defeater to think that this is a weird relationship with lots of people as a single man. I mean, John Wyatt needs to deal with that head on. And it's interesting. I just realized how much that hermeneutic of suspicion, however much John gives the justification why one shouldn't have a hermeneutic of suspicion, it is very ingrained in us. And I think that's one thing that we'll have to kind of explore more, I think, in terms of what is John Stott's a model that actually works for today. But he does talk a lot about in various parts where friendship goes wrong. He draws on, interestingly, the chapter on that, he draws on this experimentation that was done by a guy called Biderman, which was dealing with American Korean vets who came back and why they had kind of how they'd been manipulated, really. So he talks about the evidence from that Biderman study on things like isolation, monopolization, destabilizing people, making threats. So all the ways in which friendship can go wrong. There's a little bit on the, what do we call this, spiritual abuse, which I don't like to call it that. Let's call it pastoral malpractice, but whatever term we want to use. And he realizes this is a new category. But then he puts in what the boundaries should be for healthy relationships. For example, they're to be non-sexual, non-coercive, etc., etc. I mean, the non-sexual, non-coercive. I mean, it comes up about 3 different points in the book. So it's not just he doesn't just mention that once. There is quite a dwelling on those aspects, obviously, for because of contemporary situations that we're trying to deal with. So yeah, that's how he deals with that. But I think you're right, Jenna. He's definitely on the front foot, and he really does want to say something really positive, but has to kind of give an apologetic, I think, for friendship, as well as a constructive vision.
Yeah. What were your thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, actually, kind of rereading it, this morning, or going through it again, what really struck me about this particular question of kind of power dynamic, and he does a good job, I think, of placing it in the context of the development of the hermeneutic of suspicion, that there's a cultural, philosophical backdrop to the way in which we discuss these questions, and I think it's not quite clear how, I think from the book, but it might be said that some of that has helped us to respond to what we have experienced in the last in the last 10 years or so. I mean, that's a question for discussion. But anyway, I was actually thinking about the kind of cross-cultural ministry aspect of all of this, and it comes through very clearly in some of the examples of friendship that he lays out in the chapter where he talks about John Stott's friends from across the world, and just the dynamic of how often missions are in situations where those who are on the receiving end of Western missionaries find themselves as those who can be exploited, who can be their power, their agency, their freedom is kind of limited. But and it made me think of the there's a famous kind of declaration at I think it's the 1910 Edinburgh World Council of Churches meeting, where one of the bishops from India stood up and basically said, you send West, thank you for sending us missionaries from the West for generations, but you give us everything, you promise us everything, but what we really crave is friendship. We want you to be our friends, and part of that dynamic is about seeking to create relationships which are transparent, which are mutual, which are not coercive, and in John Stott's own, the examples that he gives of the various relationships that John Stott had with people from other countries, I think he enacted what being a friend cross-culturally looks like, and so that there's a sort of I think he avoids hagiography. I mean, but that's a question that we may want to come back to. But I think that's a really profound example of, I think, Dan, you mentioned that John Stott is somebody who apparently in private practiced what he was seeking to persuade the church to become. Certainly in terms of kind of cross-cultural ministry. He talked. There's one example. I think it's with. I wrote it down. One of Maria Fernando. He invites him to speak, and then he goes out and he asks him, can you tell me what some of our blind spots are? And I think there are just those kind of moments, are disarming moments which remove the power from from those who hold it, which I think
That
are
just
really
struck me as sorry, I just chipping
yeah,
in
go on.
here. That just struck me as something I can't actually recall exactly, to the extent to which John takes this really head on in the book, but it's kind of illustrated all the way through. Is that a huge amount of what goes on in a healthy friendship is that it actually transfers power away from the powerful, the most obviously powerful person. And I just think that's a really interesting kind of litmus test for us to be applying, is to what extent is this friendship relationship actually raising up and strengthening the power of the sort of the less high profile, or the less experienced, or the less obviously powerful person in the dynamic.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that again, I don't. There is a danger with this book that it's too heavily focused on John Stott, but I think that we we'd be wise to really reflect seriously on the um, the fruit of John Stott's ministry. I mean, I'm thinking particularly in terms of kind of the global church, and that's not that was a message, but I think it was also evidenced in in the details of his life, and how he practiced friendship cross culturally. And that's not to say that it's that we may want to come back to kind of looking at whether or not John Stott should have that status as we think about this question. But I think it's really instructive and actually encouraging, to see where some of those things have ended up. Yeah.
I felt that I mean, different people may take different reasons on this. I didn't feel as though he was kind of expecting the example of John Stott to carry all the weight of the memoir wasn't carrying the manifesto wasn't entirely based on the memoir part, if you like. So I can't particularly comment on the kind of life and friendships of John Stott. It felt more like it had been the jumping off point for a bigger thing that John Wyatt is inviting us to, a much more positive kind of vision for
although I think one of the things there though, Jen, is because I think John's very clear on the categories towards the end of the book, saying friendship is different from mentoring, it's different from coaching. So he outlines these different, he's the mutuality of friendship. I still have a question: was it a symmetrical relationship still with Stott? I mean, I know throughout 30 years, obviously I mentioned about, sometimes they were there for each other, but it still seems to be an asymmetrical relationship in some ways. A godly one.
I suppose my rejoinder to that is, to what extent does that matter if one of the outcomes of that was that John Wyatt grew enormously in confidence, in depth of theological thinking, in influence, in a way that is a great blessing to us now, as he's a voice in.
Yes, but John's very clear, isn't he? John's very clear that what's the difference between mentoring and friendship is that mentoring is a much more one way. And I know John Wyatt says that John Stott got a lot out of the friendship with Wyatt. Okay, but still, there's still a seniority there. And again, this thing about you just don't. I mean, was it all spontaneous? I mean, because obviously John Wyatt says that John Stott didn't articulate a theory of what he was trying to do in having friends or whatever.
Yeah.
You don't know how intentional was it, how organic was it, how much was it planned. I those things. I mean, I just think obviously the discipline of John Stott's life, which comes through very clearly.
Yeah.
But he must have been. There must have been an intentionality to say, I'm going to ask this guy for coffee and not another guy at All Souls or someone else. I mean, there must be some selection criteria at that point, and I just don't know what don't know what those things are.
What I found helpful was that I think he blurs categories that I certainly personally feel a little bit more comfortable keeping in place and am challenged by. So it's very easy to be a mentor and keep somebody at arm's length, whereas he's describing a kind of a breaking of that kind of outer boundary and a willingness to kind of expose vulnerabilities and make it more two-way than your average mentoring relationship might be. Jonathan, you were going to sort of take us on to just talking about his kind of vision for friendship, which picks up on all of this.
Yeah, I mean, so we can really carrying on. I've got a few questions really about how the book might be useful. So obviously he's got this. John Wyatt has this vision for transforming friendship, and also it does really come as a sort of plea to pursue this. You know, he does clearly see that there's something lacking certainly within society, Western society, and within the church, and you know, so you know, and you've laid out the kind of historical and philosophical reasons for that, Jen, earlier. I think I want to come back to this question of you know, John Stott, you know, because obviously, you know, I wonder whether this book started as a kind of as a memoir, you know, and John Stott's reflections on his relationship with John Stott, and then kind of reflecting on the quality of the friendship, and then kind of moving on to a broader reflection on the nature of friendship. But the fact that John Stott does occupy, you know, that position within the book. I wondered about the question of is there is he wanting this book to say something particularly for those who are in pastoral leadership? So is there something about, I mean, it's a book clearly for all of us to read and engage with, and I don't, you know, he doesn't, he certainly doesn't sort of present it in this way. But I suppose my question is, really, are we, how should the Christian leader respond to what they read in this book about, you know, John Stott's the example, and what's the quality, and if that is the case, is there a desperate need for this book amongst our Christian leaders in terms of kind of friendship?
What was your own conclusion on that?
I mean, I would assume that given the fact that John Stott, you know, is the sort of is the central figure, you know, as you said, it's within the bigger context. I would assume that he's wanting us to reflect on John as a model leader in many of these ways, not necessarily to in the particularities, but certainly some of the certainly that kind of posture to be investing in people. Yeah, that would be my thought.
How about you, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said that, I mean, when we first started chatting about the book, I mean, this is maybe this shows more about me than anyone, but I suppose part of it, I mean, Stott is a great model, but again, he's, you know, there's a uniqueness about him, and also just his life situation, you know, I'm married with tons of kids, and I can't have that kind of relationship, that amount of relationships. Although having said that, I think Jonathan and I both finished the book, and the first thing we did is I reached out to some people who I'm very close to and said, I'm really glad that you're my friend. And, I think the friendship thing and also the mentoring thing, I know it's blurred, but actually I do want to keep those apart because, John Wyatt's conversation that we had with him, Jen, was about there's like a missing generation of people, bringing them through in terms of thought leadership, which is true. But I think that's very different from my dear personal friends who have stuck with me and I've stuck with them over a long time. And maybe there is a bit of a blurring of those two things into the one person with someone like Stop. I don't know.
Yeah. But Adrian's made an interesting point here in the chat, saying just partly just sort of recognizing that the context has changed so much, and therefore we probably still need more help with application. But perhaps it's really interesting because I sort of reflect back on my reading of this book, and I suppose the John Stott element didn't dominate in my reading of it, and maybe that's because I was doing a kind of unconscious translation out of context. So what resonated with me about it was the sort of challenge that perhaps the way I give of myself to other people is often a bit transactional. So I get a lot of requests for sort of mentoring, either in quite a substantive way or in a one-off kind of way. And it's possible to be quite efficient about that, and also really boundaried about it with, so you can give a lot of your knowledge without giving a whole lot of yourself. And so what I found a sort of interesting kind of corrective or kind of challenge to me was thinking about the extent to which I allow a degree of intimacy to come into those interactions with people, one, and also about the extent to which I kind of commit myself to those people and those relationships in a slightly more enduring way. My life is not John Stott's life. What I've got to offer the world is not what he had to offer. But I nonetheless kind of thought that there is a different way of thinking about coaching, mentoring that is less transactional and more committed, more vulnerable, more disclosive of myself, and the extent to which actually some of that might help with some of our uncomfortable power dynamics, whilst taking us to other uncomfortable spaces at the same time. I don't know whether that makes sense, but
yeah.
What did you make of the intergenerational question that he really is posed throughout the book, again because of John Stott, but not but it's there with Ruth and Naomi, and then he comes back to it with the Timothy and Paul relationship, and it's clearly a really important theme and question that he wants to raise. And it's not just you could do a book on friendship, biblical account, and really not identify that intergenerational kind of nature. I think. What did you make of that?
My impression was that partly that comes out of his experience, but partly out of his this, as Dan mentioned, this concern about the fact that we are not bringing through, or in his perception, we're not bringing through a new generation of thought leaders, and I think there is something in that. And so that is necessarily intergenerational, because you're going to get more experienced people engaging with, getting alongside, coaching, mentoring, or being friends with, across a range of different possibilities. People who are at a different stage of life from them. I realized actually when I was reading back, just skimming back and preparing for this, that I have actually been the beneficiary of something very close to what he describes in a professional sense. So there was an absolutely wonderful, very senior practitioner in my field, who appointed herself my mentor, and she was probably about 15, 20 years older than me. And it really was primarily a kind of professional development thing that she wanted to sort of see me sort of go on in my professional area. But she shared a lot of herself, and she had really significant health issues, that she described a lot of what she was doing to overcome them and deal with them and to continue as a practitioner in the face of them. She died a couple of years ago with COVID complications related to her own health, immunity issues and so on. And just realizing that how she operated, what she gave me was closer to this kind of stock picture than I had perhaps quite appreciated. And that was challenging to me to think, who am I giving that kind of attention and energy and of myself too.
But there's still an intentionality to that. I suppose I mean, an answer to that and Jonathan's question, I still think I mean, the intergenerational is great in terms of it. You say it models diversity, but at the end of the day, there does seem to be still an exclusivity with these things. In that, we've had a discussion amongst conservative evangelicalism about this idea of blokes worth watching. This kind of model of, and is this just another version of blokes worth watching, but it's more on kind of cultural transformation and the social issues than just on a narrow view of gospel ministry. And in that point, friendship, I suppose. What does friendship look like for people who are not going to be the next or the people who don't have the intellectual capacity or don't have the social status? John Wyatt has gone on to had a very public career, as a lot of those people who are the 10 people who give their kind of testimonies about John Stott's influence. They're all movers and shakers. Now, I mean, but friendship is sometimes about with people who aren't like me on those things. So that's just a question, I suppose.
I mean, he does attend to that, doesn't he? And but, I mean, I think what's quite interesting is the way that, I mean, he does refer to the work of Nuon. I never know how you pronounce that.
Henri. Yeah, I just call
him Henri. And then, there's quite a lot of reflection on the nature of friendship within the Catholic tradition, and particularly, in the work of Lebris, and what friendship looks like with those who are disabled, and who are not, investing in friendships with those who are who aren't powerful, and that there's no kind of productive end to it. That the end of it is the friendship itself, and that those who that the powerful so-called kind of are enriched by engagement with the apparently weaker party. I mean, so he does make some reference to that, but yeah, you're right that the examples, I suppose, because of the nature of it, the stories, the testimonies are of those who have gone on to be, significant in some way. But might we assume that there are many who weren't? I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's.
Well, yeah. I mean, John Wyatt alludes to the fact that he thinks there could be hundreds of people who Stott was in correspondence with. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Patty Parks has raised, hello Patty, great to see you. Just raised a question there. Isn't it more transformative and effective to mentor as Christians? Obviously, you can't be close friends with everyone. So some of what you're kind of mentioning there, Jonathan, but isn't that the value of having that kind of friendship? And do you want to comment on that either of you? I just think I mean, my first reaction to that is that our kind of doctrine of humanity, that we're all of value, is so important in this. So yes, it's wonderful to sort of mentor people who can go on to lead ministries or become a thought leader in medical ethics or whatever it might be. And there are some decisions that you're making on that. But yeah, there's something about avoiding the blokes worth watching kind of dynamic, and giving of ourselves to those that the Lord has placed us next to, who are not necessarily strategic in our eyes. I don't know whether that's the kind of thing that you're thinking there, Patty. But do you want to say anything else on that, Dan or Jonathan?
No, I just think both things are valuable, but don't confuse the two. I mean, I think the bringing on of the next generation in all kinds of areas is crucial. I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think that. But I think that can be very different from friendship in terms of thinking of my closest friends.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you think the point is that if we describe something as a mentoring relationship, it, as you say, Dan, I think it's legitimate to distinguish it from the kind of that intense intimate relationship that he starts off the whole discussion with. Nonetheless, the point is that if mentorship has if it doesn't have any of the characteristics,
yes, I agree. Yeah,
then there's something disordered in it. And so really friendship is the kind of category which you should really shape the way that you mentor. It's not going to be what friendship is, but it needs to have significant
yeah. But I suppose it's back to Adrian's point, is that if Stott was alive now, in what's intervened in the culture in the last, no, even since he died, there's a lot of questions there about that model and how that would be perceived, received.
Yeah. Katie has put a great little example in the chat there. Thank you so much for sharing that, Katie. You've created an evangelistic booklet. If that is published, would you love to put the link in for people to into the chat for people to be able to do that? So stories of friendships with rough sleepers and how they teach us. And I think this is, this sort of sense that we're all growing through our friendships, and it's just such a different approach to power, isn't it? It's, not in the Christian world, but I remember reading a book on helping. I'm trying to think of the author, who's not coming to mind offhand, but just how the dynamics of helping can really be a kind of unhealthy or a helpful power thing. So when I offer help, then I'm the person with the power. When I accept help, then the other person holds power, and that my requesting and accepting help is as important in leadership and so on as my ability to offer people. And that whole helping dynamic of power. We're just coming to the end of our time, and there's a long post that I can't kind of read at the same time, but this is all from Katie. Katie, this is brilliant. Thank you. So 4 points there about purposeful, focused on transformation of the heart, growing in closeness, and open-ended and future aimed. That's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for contributing that. Jonathan and then Dan, just very briefly, what's one takeaway for you personally on this, so we can have a sort of reflective conversation about the book itself, but what's one takeaway for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I found it very helpful, instructive read, and I think takeaway would be to really reflect on the nature of my friendships, and also to give thanks actually to God for those who've been friends to me. I think that's
Yeah.
the and yeah, I think that would be a key takeaway. Yeah.
You, Dan?
Yeah, I think yeah, thanks to God for friends who, and again, this idea that friendships and relationships go through stages, when sometimes you rely on your friends, sometimes they rely on you, and there's a natural cycle, and that's very thankful to God for that. And again, I do think, you know, the bringing through the next generation of thought leaders is I think very important, and it has to be intentional, and doing that in a way that also has a friendship aspect to it, I think is important as well. So I do thank John for the book.
Yeah. I think one of the big takeaway for me personally is wanting to sort of blur boundaries in both directions, from, you know, my just friendships and my just mentoring relationships, if there's ever such a thing. So for mentoring relationships, wanting to be quite intentional about building in more of a kind of friendship, relational, two-way vulnerability elements to those, and being willing to go there, if you like. And then for my sort of just friendships, is just thinking through how in those friendships I can perhaps be a bit more intentional about helping people to think through where they exercise influence and how they can grow in there for godly purposes, and all of those concepts. Just kind of helping those two categories to sort of grow much more into one another, I think.
That's helpful.
Be really quite helpful. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you for Katie. Thank you for those mentions, and for various other inputs that people have provided as well. If you've got other books you want to suggest that might be good to review, let us know. And if we don't see you before then, have a good summer. God bless.
Thanks everyone.